First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation, and especially Jean-Christophe for getting us together in this amazing place. I think we all agree on that. So I think we should always doing these conferences in Marseille next to the Calanque. That's like my main take-home message. So I'm working at the Institute of Evolution at Montpellier, not too far away from here. And today I would like to talk about work that is motivated by rapid environmental changes that are happening, especially during the last decades, and work that is rooted on dynamical systems theory that has a long tradition of studying in ecology. So I'm not going to talk about really new things. I'm going to talk about things that we have been doing for a long time, and we are looking them or revisiting them from a different perspective. So yes, it works. So last month, the United Nations adopted the last synthesis chapter of the IPCC report that actually acknowledges major climatic events happening in the future, but still offers a glimpse of hope that we might avoid them if we start acting now. And some of these major climatic events may look very dystopian like this, regions in the Earth that are looking very different today, like polar regions, will start looking more like tropical environments. And this type of dystopic pictures actually are not too far-fetched from reality if you think that that's how the Earth looked like 50 million years ago. A greenhouse Earth with no ice caps was as much warmer. It was sustaining this type of systems in regions as cold as we know them today. But in fact, climate scientists already for a few years have been providing evidence that we probably this is not just some random projection. It's like probably we have already crossed tipping points, and at least certain climate subsystems around the Earth are already, shifting, and we might see these changes in the coming decades. Like one classical example is the thermoline circulation. That's the circulation that brings warm water from the Gulf of Mexico to the coast of North Europe and keeps the climate stable and relatively warm as we know it today. But more than 12,000 years ago, this circulation collapsed. The climate, at least in that region, became much more colder. Likely for us, it relapsed, and we're in this, more or less stable Holocene phase. But there is evidence that the circulation is weakening, and maybe we're going to see a similar type of event in the not so far future. But it's not only in climate that we have abrupt shifts in different states. Whole biomes may transform. This is the Sahel region. Today we know it as a desert state, but more than 5,000 years ago, it looked more like a savanna type of ecosystem, lush with vegetation. But then, around this time, things have changed, and it shifted and stayed in this desert state condition as we know it today. But we don't need to go too far in time and in space. We have a lot of examples from ecological systems around us that are undergoing this type of abrupt changes. This is the classic example of the Atlantic Cod. During the 90s, it underwent a major collapse, probably due to a combination of environmental factors and overfishing. Iconic ecosystems like coral reefs, there is evidence, empirical and theoretical, that may shift from a healthy coral dominated state to a state outgrown and dominated by macroalgae. And there is also the classical example that I have been studying quite a lot since I consider myself kind of an aquatic ecologist, that shallow lakes may shift from a clear water to a turbid water state due to eutrophication. So the question is, for this type of systems across different scales in time and space and different systems, whether we can be able to understand and, more importantly, anticipate this type of tipping point responses to stress in order to mitigate or adapt to them if we cannot avoid them. So today I would like to talk a little bit about these ideas. First, I would like to give you kind of an overview of how we're trying to develop a research program towards the direction of detecting tipping points and quantifying resilience. And tipping points and resilience are two concepts that are strongly related, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Then I would like to tell you about a line of research that during the last years has gained a lot of speed, a lot of attention, whether we can start to doing this type of resilience assessments at global scales. And third, I'll take a different look and ask the question of whether we can understand something about tipping points if we account for ecoevolutionary dynamics. So let me start about this short, let's say, overview by just saying what is a tipping point, or at least how we're trying to define them. So we're talking about change. Change is abrupt. It's unexpected, which is more defined like that it can be triggered by just small disturbances. We're not talking about change that is happening due to a major external event. And it can lead to substantial effects. So otherwise, it's also called catastrophic. A definition that we have in mind is that we're talking about a situation where we have this accelerating change that will be caused by a strong positive feedback that would lead your system from its current state to a completely different state. So if we want to graphically represent that and put it in a bit more formal situation, is like we're not talking about this case here. So here we have, let's say, the stressor or your parameter that changes very slowly, and here you have the ecosystem state, the equilibrium state. We're not talking about this type of changes where you can have a very strong response, but it happens gradually, like step by step. We're more referring to this situation where you are suddenly reaching a point, and then you are shifting from this state, from this equilibrium to this alternative equilibrium. It's a classical, of course, it's a bifurcation point, it's a local bifurcation point, it's catastrophic, it's a long history behind it. We call it tipping point, we call it catastrophic shift, we call it critical transition, we call it discontinuous transition, we call it more generally regime shift. A lot of confusion, but that's what I will have in mind when I will be talking about tipping points. And if we look more in detail into this picture, so there are a few things to consider. First of all, to consider, and that's why it makes them interesting for us. Once you shift to this state, then of course you want to recover. At least that's like the human reaction to that, because we're thinking that this state, it's like a very anthropocentric of course view. We think that this state is the good state and this is the unfavorable state. So we want to recover it, but to recover we need to reduce the stress to a much lower threshold. We have to reach this threshold to meet another tipping point that would now allow us to go to the previous state. And because of this lag, or this difference, which is called hysteresis, now the question comes of whether that is possible to do. And in most cases, probably this is not possible. So once we get this change, the change will be reversible. And that's when things are starting to get very worried. How can we recover the thermoline circulation if it stops, right? And of course, the region where, for the same conditions, we have these two different states is the region of bistability, and that's important to note because now we can have, like a different type of transition. So the dashed line between the two black equilibria states is the unstable equilibrium that actually defines the basin of attraction. Above this line, either you end up here, or below this line, you end up here. So now if you have a strong disturbance caused by, like external perturbations, stochasticity, you call it, you can move over this line and then you shift your system to the alternative state, so without crossing the tipping point. So you have a different, or a second type of tipping that is more, that's called like noise-induced tipping compared to this bifurcation tipping. In any case, what is interesting to note is that for these different systems that I shortly described before, we can build the same model. We can at least hypothesize that they are driven by the same underlying mechanisms or similar mechanisms that give rise to the similar to a similar model that has this tipping point behavior. And then the question comes of whether we'll be able to detect this type of response in advance, taking advantage of the fact that they are all governed, or that's hypothesis, that are all governed by the same type of underlying model. And that's not an exaggeration. Actually, we can write models of simple or even more complex models that have this structure, so they have a tipping point for any of these cases. So one way to do that is like by taking into account of what happens to the resilience of the system. And the resilience here is defined as this distance between the stable and the unstable equilibrium. And what you see very clearly, this one-dimensional space, that you have a reduction in that resilience. Here, the resilience vanishes at the tipping point. So let's recap. Resilience is that distance, which is verbally defined as the magnitude of disturbance that the system can undertake before shifting to this alternative state. And then we can claim that, okay, then if we can see that loss of what is in ecology, we call it ecological resilience. If we see this loss, then we can associate it to the proximity of a tipping point and that potential high risk of reaching that tipping point. But there is a problem. We cannot measure this distance. I mean, we can measure it in the models, but it's very hard to measure it in the data. So we get stuck in that sense. But we can take advantage of some other also universal phenomena that happen around tipping points, around bifurcations. And that's the phenomenon of critical slowing down. If you know this picture, at least the older ones in this room should know this cartoon. We have this classical illustration where the coyote tries to catch the roadrunner, runs over the cliff, and then over the cliff, that freezes. And before it freezes, it falls into the abyss. So something similar happens also close to the vicinity of tipping points. The systems freeze, dynamics become very slow. So let's take advantage of that critical slowing down, which is basically described already, in dynamical systems theory very long ago, and use it to derive some type of what we will call resilience indicators or early warnings. So if we take two situations, we are far and close to the tipping. The first thing that a very simple thing that we find as a consequence of this slowing down is that if we have a perturbation, it will take longer to recover. So recovery time will increase, or recovery rate will become slow, the speed will become slower of recovering back to the equilibrium state. Now, if we don't have this disturbance, but we have this small amplitude, noisy fluctuations on our system, you see that the signal that is produced is very different in terms of variability. So very, very easily we can say, okay, that we can see an increase in variance. And instead of looking at the variance, we can just look at another property of the time series. That would be the correlation of today versus tomorrow. And here you see as we're closer to the tipping point, the correlation today starts to look more like tomorrow. The correlation increases because the system is slow, doesn't move so much. So what you see today, you see tomorrow more or less. So we have these three different indicators that have been reviewed now quite some time ago, but since that review, there has been more work and more, let's say, expansion of the idea, where basically we're trying to look at changes in the statistical signatures in time or space that would use to infer loss of resilience, and we connect this loss of resilience to a proximity to a tipping point. So I'll give you at least some examples of like proof of principle where we start trying to see if we can actually do that with in empirical systems. So this is the case of an experiment run in a chemostat. Phytoplankton population. Bernd did a good introduction, so you know everything about chemostats now, don't have to say anything. And basically what we did was to increase light intensity, knowing that the phytoplankton in this case can collapse due to an overexposure to light. And so this is time, and along the time of the experiment, we were measuring density, and we were performing these 6 perturbations. So we were making these perturbation experiments, and because we were interested to see how fast the system will recover back to equilibrium as we were approaching this tipping point to collapse. So this is the recovery rate that we measured out of these 6 perturbations, and you see that the system became slower and slower over time, closer to the tipping point, which for us it was like a demonstration that indeed in a living, very controlled situation, we can find this signature of slowing down. Back at that time, where ecological data were not so available, we tried to see if we can see some similar signature of slowing down in continuous, more or less, measurements. And that's why we looked at paleo data from climate reconstruction. This is, again, the example of thermal line circulation. This is a proxy of the shutdown and the restart of the circulation. And here what we did was like to just look at what happened before the event. So we consider this is considered the tipping point. So we forget about this part of the data and we only looked at this part of the data. And within a moving window, we estimated autocorrelation, the change in autocorrelation as we were coming closer to this tipping event. And what we found was an increasing trend, very noisy, but still an increasing trend in autocorrelation. That could give at least some, not proof, but some indication that indeed what we're expecting as a slowing down, we will be able to also retrieve it in an empirical record if we had long enough monitored data. So a lot of water has run since then, and these ideas have been picked up, of course, a lot in ecology and also in climate. These are the two major I would say domains where we're studying this type of perspective in looking at dynamical behavior, but also in other fields of research. Of course, things are not so like easy and crystal clear. Doesn't mean that these type of indicators are working all the time. We can have cases where you can have tipping events without this type of indicators that I just explained, but also there can be indicators that you see these changes, but without necessarily having a tipping point. And that's like a nice classification of different bifurcation types, and where you can see that these indicators related to slowing down that I showed you before is only are related to a subset of bifurcations that are not necessarily all tipping points. But nonetheless, the aim is, at least for me, the aim is like whether even if the theory doesn't work, all the time, and there are a lot of limitations, how much can of these be applied to real data sets and give us some information when we cannot build, actual models, and we don't know the actual mechanisms. So for this, there's a lot of work done on developing methods and statistical signals, both in time and in space, to infer this type of changes in the behavior of systems. But basically, they all boil down to try to measure changes in variance in autocorrelation as a function of time or some potential stressor. If you don't know the stressor, you assume that over time something is changing, and you try to see if these two properties behave according to your expectations. So an increase in these two indicators would mean that something perhaps is happening. The system is losing resilience and may approaching a tipping point. And we can use it, as a real early warning signal, like that if you are able to monitor your system, like monitor your lake continuously and see these changes, and you will say, okay, something is about to happen, maybe an algal bloom, maybe eutrophication is going to hit in. Or if you don't have this very long monitoring, but you have a lot of replicates across different sites in space, or you have different species in a community, you can use this for mapping, making resilience maps, and also then ranking different sites according to their resilience in order to highlight priority areas, or areas where actually, you can, if you find the opposite pattern, that something good is happening, areas that the resilience is gaining, then is lost. Again, we're always used to talk about the bad things. We're not thinking about the opposite picture, because we would also be happy to find variance going down and autocorrelation going down, which means gain in resilience, which can also be very, very helpful for when you do restoration practices, for instance. In any case, I would like to show you a little bit this of how we try empirically to go along this idea using data at big scales, at global scales. And for this, I'll talk about some work we have done with Miguel Verdugo, now at the University of Complutense in Madrid, where we looked at drylands, global drylands, and we try to see, like the prevalence of abrupt shifts in drylands that we can connect to tipping points, and I'll explain why. And more importantly, then to understand, when this type of shifts, if we find them occur. So drylands, I think we kind of understand there are places where it doesn't rain a lot. They can take different forms. They are globally distributed. They can look like this, or they can look way more arid like this. But still, you see, they are trying to bring back vegetation. So it would be nice to know if their project is happening or not, based on some kind of indirect and easily measured quantity. But most importantly, drylands support a lot of people. A lot of people are living in drylands. Actually, there are around 2 billion people where their livelihoods depends on dryland ecosystems, and drylands are covering quite a big chunk of the earth. Of course, as I said, there is like a huge variation in terms of their aridity. So they are very highly risk and very sensitive ecosystems, and very important for a lot of reasons. And that creates the need to understand how they are changing, right? And whether they are changing in tipping point ways, which perhaps means irreversible ways. And the reason that we think that like abrupt changes in drylands can be related to tipping points is the fact that, on one hand, we have very strong models that show that like their behavior and the mechanisms present in drylands can fall into this type of model. And the other reason is that when you look at the data, and this is remote sense data of vegetation cover over a gradient of aridity, you see that there is some kind of threshold in aridity where you cannot sustain any more vegetation down here, and there is a range of aridity values where you have like everything in between that could be more or less seen as a potential area of bistability in the system. So based on conceptual mechanistic models and on some empirical observation at large scales, we can hypothesize that abrupt shifts may be reversible and may be related to tipping point responses in dryland ecosystems. So we asked these 2 particular questions in this project, trying to see how common are abrupt shifts that, as I said, could be related to tipping points. In the productivity dynamics, basically in how much vegetation is produced in drylands. And then try to go one step further, try to understand what drives, if we can find driving factors that affect the presence of these abrupt shifts. So we worked with the remote sensing data. That's as I told you, the large-scale patterns that now we are more in the position to look at, because we have, from the satellite products, we have at least 20 years of data. So we can start playing with these ideas of measuring resilience, because we can have now the statistical power to do this type of analysis. So we use the NDVI, which is this vegetation index that represents productivity of vegetated ecosystems in general. We had this 20 years period of monitoring, and we covered like quite a big chunk of. We were able to have a big chunk of what represents drylands globally, and what we did was basically to classify the potential trajectories of NDVI that would look like these curves that you have here, into 4 classes of shapes, like whether you have like a linear change over time, whether you have a step change that would be like an abrupt shift, whether you have no change in your trajectory, or you have a quadratic, more kind of a non-linear response, but still with not an abrupt with no threshold. So we classified all these 41,000 pixels that represent patches of vegetation in these 4 categories, and basically that's what we found. So the first thing that we found was kind of also nice result. It was like that more than half don't change. So for more than half of the drylands, we didn't report any changes over time. So things maybe have fluctuated, but more or less the vegetation remained, let's say, stable or constant. But what's interesting was for the less than half, first of all, we saw that most of them were changing in a positive way. So there is an increase in drylands, contrary to what we always think, that is, always things go bad. And there was one place, of course, there were less that there were where we had a negative trend. But in both positive or negative, what was interesting was that the majority of the cases, the changes were abrupt. So things were not changing in a gradual way, but they were changing in an abrupt way. So the best model based on AIC criterion was giving us that they looked like a step function. So they were experiencing these abrupt shifts. So we looked a little bit closer, trying to understand, at least based on what we know of where they occur and why. So you see here the distribution of the positive only and the negative abrupt shifts. And you see that the positive ones are more centered in Asia, where you have a lot of regreening projects going on, actually, and a lot of land abandonment and afforestation. On the other hand, the negative ones are happening in places that are more, like, how do you call it, the usual suspects, like more in South America, where you have actually the opposite patterns, where you have more degradation and more deforestation tactics and policies. Not policies, but practices. When we looked at how this abrupt changes happen over time, we didn't find any particular pattern. So, I mean, the classical hypothesis is that there is more and more pressure, over the years. So our hypothesis was to see an increase, for instance, in the negative ones, but we didn't see any particular pattern in terms of a trend that there is more and more of these things happening over the last years. So the next thing was to try to see if we could find the drivers of either the positive or the abrupt change. So we have these abrupt changes. What drives them? Is there some factors, some variables that are affecting them? So for this, we collected climatic, topographic, soil, and some anthropogenic variables. It's like a whole list. You see quite a lot, more than 10. And then we use some random forest models where we try to classify, based on these variables, the probability that we would have a positive or a negative abrupt shift. And we did this separately for the negative and for the abrupt change. We didn't do it at the same time, because the result actually was different if you will try to understand what drives positive compared to what drives negative abrupt shifts. So I don't want you to look at this at all, like only I want to concentrate on just looking at the, let's say the top 5 here factors that are important for the negative ones. You see they are not ranked in the same way as for the positive ones. So you see there are different potentially this indicates that there are different drivers that will be important in making a positive or a negative abrupt change. Our hypothesis, to some extent, was that maybe it's the same drivers, so the same things that have changed, the same things you have to manipulate if you want to do the opposite. But that's not what this result tells us. And in fact, what was also interesting was that aridity, that's like the factor that we are using in dryland ecology to try to understand responses. It was not in the top 5 factors that are affecting abrupt responses in dryland vegetation. Anyway, if I can summarize a little bit what we did here, is that we didn't find changes in productivity dynamics in more than 50% of the drylands. We found that positive trends were higher than negative ones, so basically good, more or less good news. But when productivity changes were recorded, it was mostly abrupt. So still you have this abrupt, and to some extent unexpected and surprising behavior. So which can be problematic in terms of management. And as I said, the positive and the abrupt ones are not driven by the same processes, and aridity was not one of these main processes, contrary to our expectations. Here, I talked about, so in this part I talked about trying to make, to identify potential tipping points by doing this abrupt change analysis. But we can also, in the same data, we can go and look at changes in resilience, like changes in variance and autocorrelation that I showed you before. And in a way, like run the same type of analysis at larger scales in the case of the drylands. That we are actually doing right now, but I can show you how it might look like in a different type of system, where forests, where actually we looked at changes in resilience at global forest dynamics. So again, we used NDVI, this vegetation index from satellite data, and here these colors represent the changes in autocorrelation over the same 20-year period that we have the satellite data. So, so now again, it's not drylands, it's forest, and here we're not looking at the shifts, but we're looking at how resilience changes regardless of how, what pattern of change the forest dynamics have. And what you see is like that, like with red will be areas that are becoming less resilient, so they're more vulnerable, and blue will be places where autocorrelation decreases, so they become more resilient. So you see again, like as expected, you see a heterogeneity of the results. And again, we try to make the connection to potential drivers. So here on the y-axis is the latitude. So it's like forests at different places on Earth across latitude. And on the x-axis, we have the change in resilience. So negative change in resilience, it would mean that you have an increase in resilience, and positive would have a decrease in resilience. It's the opposite, goes the opposite direction. And what you find, for example, is if we looked at three main drivers, basically how much forest is there, what is the background average climate conditions, and what is the climate variability, you see that it's mostly in the south hemisphere, and around the Amazon, that you have most of the where it becomes more evident that climate can have an important impact on forest resilience at these scales. These are hard to, at least even for us, these are hard to results to explain, because we're looking at global patterns. So we're analyzing a pattern. We have in mind a mechanism, but we don't have, like the ability to go and ground proof. We don't know like a specific pixel on that map if it's really the pattern we find is a negative or positive. But at the same time, we can start playing this exercise because we can start having more specific hypotheses and identify places where things seem, like on aggregate to be changing in a uniform way. And by doing this, correlations to potential drivers, we can start, like asking more specific questions in terms of how, for instance, drylands or forest ecosystems are going to respond to the environmental change. So this is all very, very new, and it's very new because, as I said before, now we have enough data, and as the data will be accumulating, because the satellites keep on collecting this data, this analysis will be more refined. It will have more depth because you will have just more statistical power and more time periods to include. So personally, I'm quite excited with this because we can, for the first time, we can apply these tools on bigger scales where the data can give you perhaps a better idea when your models are going to fail or your models are not informed enough to reproduce these behaviors. And overall, like at the end of the road, like what I would like to see was like to put these tools in order to build kind of a resilience sensing system for the biosphere, something that we can use in order to understand climate changes and ecosystem changes at big scales. But anyway, this is more down the road, and I'd like to now jump and change a little bit the perspective and talk about how evolution could maybe not be important for understanding tipping points. And the first thing when I started thinking about that a couple of years ago was, evolution has this adaptive capacity, so at least to some extent, and if you would have a rapid evolution in a system with tipping points, a very simple expectation would be, like instead of, so the black line is your no evolution scenario, the red line is the evolutionary scenario. So if you have adaptive evolution, it can be that simply, you delay your tipping, so you can sustain more of the environmental stress because you're adapting your phenotype. So that means you can live longer, but still there will be kind of a threshold because there are always, like thresholds, physiological thresholds and constraints, and then you will hit your tipping point. Of course, the other scenario could be more interesting. Could be that, you're doing, but while you're doing this process, maybe, the change is maladaptive, or the change hits, like a boundary where you get kind of evolutionary suicide, and maybe, now you are having an area collapse. Actually, now evolution or rapid evolution wouldn't help you for your system. So you can have like both results. So like that's one, like very generic, let's say, hypothesis about how evolution might affect and would play a role in understanding tipping points. This is work that Cyrine 2 days ago presented here to you. But I'm going to look at a different question, like where actually we were wondering whether would the ecosystem that we know and we have identified as very classical examples of bistability, would they have emerged would evolution lead to that parameter space where you would have this bistability or not? So you understand my question, right? So so this is work that we have done with Alice and Nicolas Loy in Paris, where we asked about whether evolutionary you can have emergence of alternative states in that classical example of shallow lakes. And that example of shallow lakes, or the particular example of shallow lakes and model of shallow lakes we selected is the one that you have submerged plants that grow within the water column, and floating plants that grow on the top of the lake, and there is competition between the two of them for nutrients and light. Basically, because of that competition, you have a very strong positive feedback. You have submerged macrophytes that they're more efficient in taking up nutrients. Nutrients are not available, so floating plants are suffering, but since they're suffering, they create a less of a shading effect, so that means submerged get more light, so that enhances their growth and they get sustained in their submerged states. If nutrients are plenty and they can reach the floating, now the submerged don't have any effect on them. They cannot take them out of the water column, so floating will start to grow more. The more they grow, the more shading they're going to produce. The shading will be detrimental for the submerged, so the submerged will release or let more nutrients available for the floating, and now you get the other, you flip the coin and you get more floating plants dominant in your lake. So this positive feedback creates these two different states between either dominance of the submerged or the floating, and there are like models that have shown that, where you have, for low nutrient availability, you have the dominance of the submerged. As nutrient increases, you get into a mixed situation where both floating and submerged are present in the lake, and once nutrients are becoming very available, as I was telling you before, now the floating will win because they are not anymore limited, and they can shade out the submerged macrophytes. Right, so we have this example. It's basically the same example that Cyrine showed 2 days ago. And there are 3 mechanisms in this model. So you have on one hand the nutrient and light limitation. You have this shading effect. So there's a direct competition for light. If you're higher on the water column, you shade. Makes logic. They have leaves. Light doesn't pass. So there's less light for the plants below. All plants need light. So lack of light means lower growth. And then you have this nutrient uptake efficiency. There is like this the other side of the picture, where the ones that live more close to the bottom, because sediments usually come from the bottom of the lake, have more availability and higher affinity for the nutrients. And what we did here was like, okay, we can add, evolution by assuming that there is a certain depth where a macrophyte can live and can take advantage of either the nutrients or the light. So the model looks like this. We don't go into the details, but basically, there are some parameters in the model. Here, for instance, this one is related to the shading. This is related to the background turbidity in the lake. This is related to the affinity of nutrient uptake, that are made now explicit functions of depth Z. So the trait that is evolving. So what we did was like to see, okay, we have these three different mechanisms. Let's see if we add them one by one, whether we will be getting this, or whether we need all 3 of them to get into this alternative state regime, or like one of them is already important, or 2 of them is already important, and they can already meet the conditions for getting into this alternative state scenario. So the first case was where we only thought about having this gradient of light. Light becomes less as we go down, and nutrient availability is the opposite pattern. There's this gradient system with a trade-off. So here the way we did it, we assumed that there is different strength of diffusion of the nutrients in the lake. So these lines here will represent the distribution of the nutrients across depth. And so you see, for instance, in that green light, with meaning we have strong diffusion in the lake, you will have few nutrients but everywhere. Whereas if you have this weak diffusion in the lake, you will have a lot of nutrients at the bottom of the lake and very few nutrients at the top of the lake. The same way, or the opposite way, is for light. So you have more light at the top of the lake and less light as we go down, and we can tune this the attenuation of light by this parameter W. So we can play different scenarios of how strong and weak this light attenuates with depth. Then we had the second scenario where we added also the asymmetric competition. That means the shading of the plants that are living higher in the water column on the plants below the water column. And here that was depicted by this function. Here on the x-axis, that's the difference in the depth. So if you are above here, you have a strong competition effect. So you're shading. Where you're below, that there's no shading. So this goes to 0. And again, we can manipulate, like how strongly this changes compared to how far one plant is from the other. So that's the second scenario. We're having the 2 mechanisms, and then here was the third scenario where we also add this unequal exploitation of the nutrients. So that as we said, that if you are lower in the lake, you have a stronger impact basically in taking up nutrients. And here the function that relates this impact with depth looks like this. And again, we can manipulate how strongly you can take up nutrients the more lower you are in the lake, or whether like this nutrient efficiency is more or less the same regardless of depth. So what did we find? On the y-axis, we have nutrient diffusion. That was a very important parameter in our scenarios. So like how much the nutrients are becoming available to the top of the lake. So you see, if diffusion is very low, you have, yeah, okay, here is missing something. Here you will have low nutrients availability to the surface, whereas here, when diffusion is high, you will have high nutrient availability to the top. And on the y-axis, we have light attenuation. So, right, how much light penetrates the water column. So here means there's a lot of light availability to the bottom of the lake, and low and high attenuation would mean that there is low light availability to the bottom of the lake. Anyway, you will see it. You will keep on seeing it, so you will understand it better, I hope. So what did we find? So we find, okay, there is this area of nothing is growing. We start from, right with we have one macrophyte in the lake. Nothing is growing, and of course nothing is growing because there is not enough light and there's not enough nutrients, so they cannot make it. Once you start to give them more nutrients and there is more light, then you have this area where you have most of the growth happening. This scale is wrong. This should be colored to understand, here the color would represent the actual depth that the macrophyte would have evolved to. But what we found that the evolution would lead us to this point. So basically, we start with one macrophyte, and the macrophyte will evolve and find the right place in depth in order to have the best growth in terms of taking advantage of nutrients and of light. Now we add the second mechanism with asymmetric competition. Now things are starting to happen a little bit, more interesting things are starting to happen. Now we have this red area, which actually is the area where you have diversification. Now the single macrophyte diversifies into a second macrophyte because, remember, our original model had submerged and floating, so two macrophytes that are competing. So in order to get this alternative states thing, we need to have these two different phenotypes present in the lake, and hopefully get them to have this strong positive feedback one against the other in order to create these alternative states. So here we meet the condition of diversification, good news, so maybe these two phenotypes can start competing strongly, but when we look at what happens is like, okay, we can have 2, 3, 4 phenotypes, but no alternative states. So when we look at the dynamics between the species, we don't get alternative states. And now we add the third mechanism, this asymmetric, this unequal exploitation of nutrients. And now what we see first is like we still get the diversification in a rather smaller range of parameters. And now we have, like one sweet spot within this range where bistability is possible. So now only with this third, or only with the inclusion of the third of all the three mechanisms, we were able to get this bistability arising. But still, this occurs for a very, narrow range, at least for this parameter space that we looked at. So to understand how to show you how exactly we define whether we get bistability or not, what we did was that we had, for instance, in the cases with diversification, this is time, this is the two phenotypes, here's the branching point, you get the two evolved phenotypes, then at some long-term moment, we take these phenotypes out and we play the ecological scenario of stressing them with nutrients. So here you see these are the densities of these two evolved phenotypes. So evolution brought you here. Now let's say you have a eutrophication scenario, what will happen? You see that the one will be present, the other one may be absent, but then you have coexistence, and then we have replacement, but no tipping point. There is no alternative states in this case. With this more specific range of parameters that I told you before, again you have diversification. You see these two phenotypes. They're slightly different from the two before. The conditions, of course, are also slightly different in terms of attenuation. But here, when we would do the same ecological scenario by increasing nutrients and doing this eutrophication experiment, you see that now you have dominance of one, coexistence, and you get now the bistability area before you have the dominance of the alternative phenotype. So this is how we were able to find out whether we will get in this bistability area or not. But long story short, it was only possible to get this if we will have, of course, diversification, and only when we involved, like all three mechanisms at the same time, which is interesting result, I think, because this is like a classical model of, like a real model and mathematical model of studying alternative states. But we were able to recover this bistability only for this relatively narrow parameter space. So this for us raises questions of how generic could that result be for bistable systems where you have a gradient like in the way we have a gradient of light and nutrients, or compared to systems that there's no gradient. So I think it's very interesting because the way we are looking at tipping points is that they are, some people will say there are not enough support for them or evidence for them, but they do. We have some cases and some like good hypotheses that they can happen. So and now the question is like, okay, but how often, how prevalent, when? And I think this type of exercises, like whether let's say evolutionary process, if you let systems by themselves, would they reach this region, like of bistability or not, or how big this parameter space is where we encounter this type of behavior is very important, because this will give us a little bit of more insight, more insight of whether like the potential risk of seeing more or more often tipping points in nature around us is valid or not. So I think I'll leave you with this question, and thank you very much for your attention.